What do Queen Elizabeth II, Catherine the Great, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Nefertiti have in common? They were all queens, but they were not treated like queens. In fact, they had it much worse than the average woman. Keep watching to find out why. Number 8. The Golden Cage. Being queen was not all fun and games. These women were locked up behind closed doors for their own safety and security. This meant that they could not freely move around or even step outside without being accompanied by a few hand-picked guards. Even when they went to church, there would be so many guards following them that the general public could not get near them. Sometimes these women did not even have access to basic things, such as toilets, which is why they had to use chamber pots instead. Talk about being royal. But what happens when your cage is made of gold? You tend to forget that it's actually a cage. Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was held captive in the Tower of London for months before her death. But don't worry, she was in a fancy 19-room suite. She was only allowed to receive 3 visits from her ladies-in-waiting per week. The poor woman was forced to eat alone in her room, and was only permitted to attend religious services at the chapel in the tower. She spent her final years living like a prisoner rather than a queen. When she died, Henry VIII refused to let her body be moved from the tower to a proper place of burial. He kept her remains in a cheap coffin in the basement of Windsor Castle for over 30 years, until he finally relented and allowed them to be moved to the place where she now rests in peace. Number 7. Forbidden love. A lot of these women fell in love with people who were beneath their social status. And for that, they were punished. If you've watched our previous videos on forbidden love, you will know that there are many tales of star-crossed lovers throughout history. However, we rarely hear about the ladies who dared to fall in love with someone below their station. Imagine being torn between your love for a man and your duty to your kingdom. That was the sad reality for many of these women. Queen Margaret of Scotland was only 16 years old when she married her cousin, King Edward VI. But their marriage was never consummated, because he suffered from a medical condition that made sexual intercourse impossible. Desperate for a child, Margaret began having an affair with a courtier named Thomas Murray. The two lovers planned to escape to France together, but before they could carry out their plan, both Margaret and Thomas were murdered. Who might have benefited from the Queen's untimely demise? Her uncle, Henry Tudor, who went on to become King Henry VII and start the Tudor dynasty. Mary, Queen of Scots, also had a rough time in the love department. She was forced to marry twice, first to the King of France, and then to her cousin, King Philip II of Spain. Both marriages were political ploys that failed. Mary was desperate to escape her loveless marriage, and had an affair with her secretary, David Rizzio. Unfortunately for Rizzio, the king found out about the affair, and he was brutally murdered in front of the Queen's eyes. Mary was later imprisoned by her son, King James VI, and she spent the last 18 years of her life behind bars. No. 6. Unwanted pregnancies. Back in the day, there was no birth control pill, and a lot of these women had unwanted pregnancies. This wasn't necessarily their fault, as men often took advantage of their position of power. Being pregnant was not a walk in the park either, as there were very high chances that the mother or the baby would die during childbirth. To make matters worse, these women were expected to give birth to as many children as possible, preferably heirs to the throne. If they weren't able to produce a male heir, they were often discarded like yesterday's news and replaced with a younger model. Queen Victoria gave birth to 9 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. One of her daughters, Princess Alice, was born with a heart defect and died at age 52. But that didn't stop Queen Victoria from continuing to try and have a son. She became pregnant 5 times after Alice's death, and miscarried every time. She was already in her early 40s by then, which made each pregnancy more dangerous than the last. Number 5. Losing the crown. The biggest nightmare for any queen has got to be losing the crown. In some cases, they lost it due to their own actions. In other cases, they were overthrown by their partners. Either way, none of them ended well. Think about it. If you had worked your whole life to get to the top and you finally reached the finish line, you would hate for it all to come crashing down. Yet that is exactly what happened to these women. Queen Isabella of England was married to King Edward II, but their marriage was not a happy one. There was a rumor going around that the king was having an affair with his favorite knight, Piers Gaveston. Isabella decided to take matters into her own hands and kidnapped the king's young son, hoping to make him her puppet. But her plan backfired and she was forced to flee to France in disguise. Soon enough, she was back in England with a small army, and she forced her husband to abdicate the throne in favor of their son. After Edward's death, Isabella tried to take the throne herself. but she was eventually defeated and spent the rest of her life in exile. Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, also lost her crown due to her inability to stay faithful. She had an affair with her secretary, David Rizzio, and gave birth to a son who was the rightful heir to the throne. But since he was born out of wedlock, he was declared illegitimate. Mary's cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne instead. Mary spent her remaining years plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, but her attempts failed and she was executed for treason. Number 4. Living in the shadows. It's hard to believe that the people of today have it bad. Just think about how these women lived back in the day. For example, Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, had to live in the shadow of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for her entire adult life. When Mary was just 5 years old, she became the Queen of Scotland after her father, King James V, died. At the same time, Elizabeth was also in line for the Scottish throne. However, she refused to accept the title and instead became the Queen of England. Because Elizabeth was Protestant and Mary was Catholic, the English people preferred Elizabeth. Mary had to spend almost all of her adult life hiding from assassins sent by her cousin. When she finally realized that she might never become Queen of England, she plotted to overthrow Elizabeth and take the throne by force. Unfortunately, her plans were leaked, and she was executed for treason. Queen Mother, Liliuokalani, was also forced to live in the shadows, but this time, it was her brother who was stealing her thunder. When Liliuokalani came to power in Hawaii, the Hawaiian people were unhappy with the direction the islands were taking. They felt that she was not doing enough to protect their culture and land from being taken by foreign investors. Her brother, Prince Lot, led a group of rebels who overthrew the government and forced Liliuokalani to abdicate the throne. The rebels then invited the U.S. government to annex Hawaii, and that is exactly what happened. The former queen was forced to live the rest of her life in her brother's shadow. No. 3. Male domination. Most of these women were married to men who had complete control over them. Sometimes these men were abusive and treated their wives as nothing more than property. Henry VIII is a prime example of this type of man. He was known for his volatile temper, and he used physical violence against those who crossed him. Henry was also obsessed with having a male heir, and he went through 6 wives in his quest to produce a son. He had 2 of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, executed on trumped-up charges, simply because they didn't give him a son. Note: spitting image. Another thing these women had in common was that they were often nothing more than a spitting image of their mothers. Take, for example, Mary, Queen of Scots. She was named after her mother, who was also called Mary. Mary, Queen of Scots, was said to resemble her mother so much that people often commented on it. The same can be said for Queen Elizabeth I and her mother Anne Boleyn. There is a famous portrait of Elizabeth as a young girl that shows her wearing the same type of dress her mother had worn in a famous painting. No. 1. Powerful lineage. All of these women were related to other powerful women who came before them. They were part of a long line of influential ladies who helped shape the course of history. For example, Queen Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her grandmother was Queen Elizabeth of York, and her great-grandmother was Queen Isabella of France. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the granddaughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her great-grandmother was Queen Isabella of France, just like Elizabeth I. The same can be said for most of the women on this list. They were all related in one way or another, and they all had powerful female ancestors who paved the way for them.